Hello, my friends. Rob Roselli coming to you once again on the Not Fox News Network. Today being Tuesday, April 25th, 2017. And again, the website boxofsunglasses.com. That's one word. Email info@boxofsunglasses.com. Twitter @Rob Roselli. Facebook Rob Roselli1. And again, I do my best to get on here Tuesday and Thursday, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And if not, the archives on boxofsunglasses.com. There's a link to this, obviously, and then link to the archives. And you go back and look at past shows. Over the past several weeks, we have been going through line by line, Matthew 24. So just to not bore you, if you've been listening and you went back and watched those old videos with the going back through all that information, let's just quickly review an overview. Remember, we talked about what Jesus really meant by the temple and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Remember, the apostles asked him, he said, how impressed they were with the temple, Herod's temple, or whatever you want to call it. And, Jesus comes out and says, you see these stones, there will not be one left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And of course, the literal fulfillment of that was AD 70 with the Roman legions, so the destruction of the Jews holding out in the temple. But of course, as is usually the case in the Bible, there's a much bigger figurative symbol behind that that you will not hear on these so-called Christian, these televangelists and these other bozos that don't know what they're talking about, telling you about ancient Israel and God's chosen people and all this other nonsense, because they wholly ignore the real source of the quote conspiracy and the real source of the satanic conspiracy that can only be explained by the Bible, the very conspiracy running the world. And I can promise you it is not Islam versus Israel, God's chosen people. And I don't want to go off on that rabbit trail right now talking about the horrible theology of Israel as God's chosen people. And we'll get into that a little bit in the next several lines of Matthew 24. But don't forget what Jesus, screams to the Pharisees right before Matthew 24 and Matthew 23, how can you escape being condemned to hell? Of course, talking to the Pharisees, and then of course he concludes, Matthew 23 with, you shall not see me again until you say, you shall not see me again until you say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. And then he leaves the temple, he leaves Jerusalem for good before he's crucified by God's chosen people, who make a covenant with him for 30 pieces of silver, as is predicted in Zechariah, I believe it's chapter 11, which means they basically made a covenant with Satan, because Satan, remember, if you read John chapter 12, had indwelt Judas Iscariot. But that's going to become very important in the next several lines of Matthew 24. And last week we had gotten to line 28. So just again, the last several shows, I'm going to say April 11th, 13th, the 18th, the 20th. Okay, and the descriptions are there. You can go back and you can listen to the build-up to this point, to where we are now, which is the again, the line-by-line breakdown of Matthew 24, one of the most cited chapters in the Bible when it comes to end times events. And just to quickly review, and this has implications for today's what's happening today, okay, as well as Matthew 24, because these current events are kind of combining into some kind of singularity, or whatever you want to call it, as biblical prophecy merges with current events. Okay, and none so pronounced as, remember this thing, okay, the so-called lost symbol, the Eye of Apollo or Osiris, okay, which is on the back of this thing, okay, and on top of this thing, which is St. John's the Divine Cathedral right here in my candidate for Mystery Babylon, being New York City, the uncapped Egyptian pyramid. Remember, we went through the whole thing with the golden ratio, the male plus the female, the rose plus the cross, the Rosicrucians, and all that. Okay, that was all discussed on the last several shows. And just to quickly review, in this magazine here with the lost symbol, U.S. News and World Report, the lost symbol, Dan Brown, it's all fun and games, right? And remember, we talked about the invisible college, okay, the Rosicrucians of the Age of Enlightenment in Europe, Isaac Newton, Paracelsus, John Dee, and all these other people, alchemist people, most of you may never have heard of. Most hopefully have heard of Isaac Newton. But anyway, so you got Rose plus the cross, the Rosicrucians, okay. This symbolizes enlightenment, the secret alignment of the elites over us imbeciles out here in the imbecile majority, to quote another member of the Invisible College, or several hundred years later, Helena Blavatsky, of course, founder of the Theosophical Society, and Helena Blavatsky, a well-known New Ager / Satanist, Freemason, and one of the main founders of the so-called New Age movement. Okay, but be that as it may, don't forget you got little baby Lucifer flying around up here. You got the golden ratio, 1.618. We've talked about that number ad nauseum. Okay, how it's related to Robert Christian, or the Rosicrucians, or the Rose plus the cross, the 18th or 6 plus 6 plus 6 degree of Freemasonry. Okay, it's all right here. It's all in front of us. It's not hidden. It's just that it's so pervasive and so pronounced that people don't even recognize it. Okay, and obviously, it's symbolized here on the front cover of my book, The Un-American Genocidal Complex, the Georgia Guidestones, founded by Robert Christian, or R.C. Christian, or the pseudonym for the Rosicrucians. Okay, the anti-Ten Commandments limit mankind to 500 million people, for example, which is like a 90% reduction in the human population, which we're going to experience here in the not too distant future as the psychopathic Satanists running the world push us into World War III over so-called, human rights violations in Syria, supposed chemical weapons attacks in Syria, babies, killing babies, all this sort of things. These are lies to begin with, but even if they were true, who the hell are we, with our sacrifice, our 50 million plus sacrifice from the American Birth Control League, or the Negro Project, which we know today as Planned Parenthood. Okay, so somehow we've deemed ourselves or knighted ourselves the arbiters of worldwide morality, and we are a moral abyss. Okay, a bottomless pit. And perhaps we'll revisit that language here in a minute. But anyway, the Un-American Genocidal Complex has many of these symbols inherent on the front cover, and you can read all about it. Again, boxofsunglasses.com. The links are there for my books. And tied in with all this, don't forget the front page of The Economist magazine. Okay, 1988, 30 years. Okay, there's the fee, the golden ratio, 0.618. Okay, the reciprocal of 1.618, and we just looked at 1.618. Okay, little baby Lucifer, remember, up here flying around above the invisible college with the years, 1.618, the golden ratio, okay, which also serves as the base of the Great Pyramid, as we've discussed ad nauseum on this show. And if you want to tie a lot of these, here's a 30 or 40 page link called It's in the Numbers. Okay, you can find this on the RC Christian page of my website, PDF. It's all for free. And you can read all about the golden ratio and how it's inherent in the Egyptian pyramid. Okay, 0.618, 1.618. Can this stuff be any more obvious? Okay, so again, if you're fortunate enough to be listening to this show right now and you're deprogrammed from the stupid asses on Fox News and the useless morons in these so-called Christian broadcasting channels, hopefully you'll learn something. But again, just getting back to this symbol here, the phoenix rising from the ashes, okay, symbolic of the, parallel to the Greek god Pan, where we got the words panic, pandemonium, etc., etc., parallel to the Greek god Dionysus of revelry, sexuality, insanity, okay, as we are a world careening towards basically insanity, all by design, because then you're going to have your chaos, you're going to have your destroyed economy by design, endless debt. It's funny how nobody asks, who we're indebted to. Yeah, we're bonds and all this. But ultimately, who we're indebted to, let's just face it, the Rothschild family right here. Okay, because every dollar created by the Federal Reserve System and the IMF is a debt instrument. Okay, I don't care who's selling bonds to who. If you follow the trail back, a created dollar is an instrument of debt. Okay, it's a Federal Reserve note. It might have passed through the banks. It might have done the circle jerk around the globe to China, buying their crap. The Americans buying their slave labor, plastic, poison crap. Okay, then China turns around and buys United States savings bonds. That's all great, but the dollars themselves, never forget, ultimately are instruments of debt issued by the Federal Reserve System, the money changers at the Federal Reserve System. Okay, and here it is, another in-our-face example of it. Now, what do we have right here? We have phi, or the golden ratio. Okay, right underneath it is the numbers 2018, and some of you may recall what we discussed is, in Freemasonry, which is really a symbol of Freemasonry. Okay, the corn, oil, and wine, corn symbolic of the Egyptian god of agriculture and death and the underworld, Osiris. One of his symbols was the corn, as well as the symbols of Freemasonry, the corn, the oil, and the wine. Okay, cornucopia. Osiris is going to supposedly, is going to issue a cornucopia of endless riches to those elites who believe in him, i.e., devil worshippers running the globe. Okay, and that's symbolized by the corn here, the phoenix rising from the ashes. Again, the ashes, the chaos of economic debt, doom, destruction, World War III, the New World, in the 2018. Okay, 2018. Okay, it's 4,000. The Freemasons start their history at 4,000 BC. So what does that make 2018? Well, negative 4,000 plus 2018 makes it the year 6018. Okay, or 0.618, or the number of the golden ratio, if you want to look at it another way, 18 over 6, or 3 sixes, or calculate or count the number of the beast, 603 score and 6. Okay, this is all very simple. Okay, once you break out of this matrix, this matrix of Fox News morons, neocon maniacs, and Israel First fake Christians that you see on these so-called Christian channels, everything kind of falls into, you ignore all those people, and you start looking at it from a totally different perspective, and it all seems to fall into place quite nicely, for lack of a better word. Okay, but that's what we have right here. All right, and don't forget. Well, let's just continue reading. So we're trying to meld this together. This line-by-line interpretation of Matthew 24 with current events and the symbolism that I'm trying to go through very, very quickly here. Realize in a 45-minute to hour show, I'm packing in literally dozens, if not hundreds, of pages of information. Okay, again, all this is available on my site, boxofsunglasses.com. So I'll do my best. I know people are busy, don't necessarily have time to read all this stuff and do all this research. So I'm trying to make it as easy as possible to follow, which isn't so easy because you end up going off on tangents all the time. But be that as it may, remember last week we kind of concluded with verse 28, for wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Okay, and this is language right out of, for example, I think Jeremiah 7. If you go back to the book of Jeremiah was an Old Testament prophet, again, just like Jesus himself, who was none too popular, because basically he was telling the, God's chosen people, you're basically evil and totally corrupt, and there's no hope for you, and God's going to punish you using other nations of the earth, in particular the Babylonians, okay, who by the end of Jeremiah took over in 586 BC and poked out the eyes, literally, of the king Zedekiah, who was the last king before the Babylonian Exodus, and Zedekiah was taken to Babylon, the Babylonian empire, okay, King Nebuchadnezzar, where he was imprisoned and died along with most of the nation of, or what was remaining of, God's chosen people, which be the 2 southern tribes of the tribe of Judah. Of course, the 10 northern tribes of Israel had been taken away by the, I think it was the Assyrians back there around 100 years earlier. Okay, I think it was 722 BC is the date I remember that the 10 northern tribes were taken away. The other 10 tribes of God's chosen people were punished for their idolatry, taken away by the Assyrian Empire. But be that as it may, that is just getting back to this concept. I mean, let's just go back on the trail, back to Matthew 24. Now you start reading about, so if carcasses and eagles gathered together. That again, that language is in Jeremiah chapter 7. God's talking about the valley of Hinnom that would be filled with dead bodies of, his chosen people that were killed by foreign enemies because of their worship of foreign gods and idolatry and spiritual whoredom and this sort of thing. And their bodies would fill that valley, okay? Which, of course, is, again, a symbolic picture. I mean, did they literally fill up a whole valley? I don't know. I doubt it, but it's more of the visual, again, in the eagles or the birds being gathered. Okay, the buzzards. That's how little respect God has. Remember, that's ancient Israel, okay, and the parallels of ancient Israel to the modern-day United States, the exceptional people, are really quite disturbing. And it all matches the language of Revelation, especially chapters 17 and 18. Okay, it's quite stunning, the mirror images of the language of the Old Testament and much of what's discussed in Revelation, in particular 17 and 18. And by the way, you can read the line-by-line breakdown of Revelation 17 and 18 on my site, Mystery Babylon USA. There's that whole link and breakdown, but let's just stick to here. And we just went through about everything. Okay, just all the lines. I don't want to rehash old information, so let's just go through here again. Line 29. Let's just start with here. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Okay, that's an interesting concept. Okay, so the sun shall be darkened. Now, what sun is he talking about? Now, I think in this case it is a literal. Since this is the end that he's talking about here. Okay, remember, just to back up a little bit. Remember, we went through 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, I believe it was, and we talked about tribulation that Paul and the rest of the apostles and the church, which is basically any Christian believer. Which hopefully you are, or you're thinking of becoming if you're listening to this right now, would experience tribulation, but then God would pay back those people that were dishing out the tribulation to his real chosen people, which is his church, which is the believers in Christ. He's going to repay them with tribulation. So there's two different tribulations, okay? And I believe that second tribulation, or that payback, is not what's being discussed here. So in other words, the tribulation, okay, is going to involve a lot of punishment of evil people, but it's also going to involve just general upheaval, World War III, just general chaos that's about to unfold in the world, economic, political, World War III chaos, okay, that's about to unfold. So it says immediately after the tribulation of those days, okay, so in other words, things are really getting near the end. So in other words, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give off her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Now, here's your sun and your moon. Now he says here Matthew assigns a her, or a female, to the moon, which is odd if it's an inanimate object. So obviously what he's referring to is the female goddess Isis, or Athena, or Diana, okay, who's associated with the female. The moon is associated with silver in Freemasonry, or the calming element of silver, whereas the sun is the active, okay, or the male component, okay. Isis, Osiris, rose plus the cross, Rosicrucians, rose cross. You combine the two, okay, you get little baby Lucifer, or their son Osiris, of Horus, okay, who's symbolized also by the 5. Okay, the Egyptians were very much into geometry. Okay, so the Pythagorean theorem is another scam. Okay, the Egyptians knew about right triangles way before Pythagoras did, around 500 BC. The Egyptians have been beat by 2,000 years. Okay, so that's just another symbol. Okay, the 3, the vertical. Okay, the phallus. Okay, like the 6,660-inch tall phallus symbol in Washington, D.C., known as the Washington Monument, is symbolized by the vertical of the 3, the base of the triangle of the 4 points of the cross, the 4 kingdoms of nature. 3, 4, they combine, you get 5. Okay, you get the 5-pointed star with this little G in the middle of it, which stands for Gnosticism, or geometry or great architect of the universe, right underneath, the eye of Lucifer, the all-seeing eye. Yea, as God said, your eyes shall be opened. I mean, can the symbolism be any more obvious, is the question. Okay, and don't forget what we just looked at, the invisible college, with little baby Lucifer flying around. Okay, you have your pentagram right here, your five-pointed star. So just to kind of, again, we're giving the background, Matthew 29, and Jesus is talking about the sun and the moon being darkened, and the moon and her. He's giving it a female name, so of course you get the pentagram. All right, the pentagram right here. Okay, now this is an interesting one. This is the god Baphomet, also an offshoot closely related to Pan. We just discussed a minute ago the god of nature and chaos and revelry. Okay, is all right there. So in other words, to get to Lucifer's kingdom or his world, the worshippers, the people that have given over to Lucifer, the dark people who cannot be negotiated with, just like Pharaoh of the Old Testament. Pharaoh, who, as you may know, represented the son of Isis and Osiris. Each pharaoh in ancient Egypt was the culmination of the union of male and female, or the five in the triangle. Okay, so the symbolism is there. So it all ties together. Okay, so the five, the five-pointed star, the pentagram. I mean, I'll keep going over this stuff. Hopefully it's starting to sink in if you're fortunate enough to be listening to this right now. So in other words, the people running the world are just like Pharaoh of the Old Testament. They can't be negotiated with. They can't be reasoned with. They can't be rationalized with. They're dark. The lights are out. They're totally gone to Satan, which means they're fundamentally insane. Okay. So after a while, you get to a point you try to make sense of all this, and you find out it doesn't make any sense. And I'm explaining to you why. Okay. And it's all right here in Matthew 24. But everything's going to go dark. Okay. And this is. Let's just read on here, because it's really getting at the sixth seal kind of. Remember what Jesus said at the end of Matthew 23, you shall not see me again until you say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. So in other words, all the people that have rejected him, both dead and living, because the dead will be risen at this point and for their judgment. Okay, everybody who died, who's destined to be judged. If you read John chapter 5, and I'm not going to go off on that right now, it definitely says that there will be a resurrection of the dead, and they're going to be here for this after the tribulation of those days. So in other words, they're going to be paid back with this great tribulation, the real great tribulation that's talked about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, not this comic book nonsense some of you may have heard about on these so-called Christian channels, with a 7-year tribulation and a post-trib and a pre-trib and all that. That's all garbage. All right, if you're listening to that or you think that's right, or just throw all that out, okay? Because Matthew 24 is pretty explicit with the rest of the Bible and what's really going on here. Okay, so if you move on to verse 31, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Okay, so in other words, the believers, okay, will be resurrected and taken out, and the believers in the flesh, there will be a last-minute rapture, okay, of people that are left, which won't be many. And I'm going to say, which can be mostly people in the United States. Okay, if you think you're going to get raptured out of here and miss this, I got news for you. It's not going to happen. But that's basically that's what's at play right there. Okay, he's gathering his elects from the four winds. Okay. I remember before. Just to rehash, just to go back to verse 22 real quickly, he says, and except those days be shortened, there should not be any flesh saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So in other words, there's still going to be a few believers alive, and things are going to happen so fast and be unfolding so quickly that God's not going to have a choice. Okay, he's going to have to come, his second coming is going to have to come back and save literally save people that are who knows what, these transhumanism and these awakened gods, and now we're getting into Steve Quayle territory, and I don't want to necessarily go into that. He's as far as that stuff goes, he's light years. I'm not going to go down that trail. If you want to, stevequayle.com, you can read about what I'm talking about there, what's about to be unleashed. But that's what God's getting at here. Is like, if I don't come back now, come back into this four-dimensional universe, nothing. It's just really, I think it's just pure compassion on his part for his believers, that he comes back and raptures out, the last few, the flesh that's left, that he plans on saving. Okay, so in other words, things on earth are going to get so bad prior to that. It's literally going to be hell on earth. And again, most believers, starting with the United States, I hope you're ready for this, okay? Because you're not going to get raptured out. It's just not going to happen that way, okay? So be that as it may, let's just jump back to, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now that's interesting. Okay, so Jesus, why would they mourn? And it says, very interesting. It says, all the tribes of earth shall mourn. So who's ever left on earth, whoever hasn't been killed or brought up to heaven or raptured out at the last second, like we were just talking about, shall mourn. And why are they mourning? The reason they're mourning is because they're sad. This is the sixth seal. Okay, these people know it's too late. Remember what Jesus said, you shall not see me again until you say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Now, they're not, Jesus isn't, I don't think they're not worshiping Jesus. I mean, there's, Philippians chapter 2, I think it is, it says, every knee shall bow to me at some point. Like every knee, like even, the Richard Dawkins, the Adolf Hitlers, the Maos, the Stalins, the people that hate God, the Huxley brothers, the United Nations, and the New Age crowd, everybody that hates God, the American Civil Liberties Union. Okay, they're gonna bow. This is what's being talked about here. Okay, because they're the ones that are left. That's why they're mourning, because they know it's too late. Okay, when he's coming back the second time, remember at the beginning, we went through this in the beginning of Matthew 24, and they said, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming, of the end of thy world? Okay, remember we went through this. Okay, now this is where this ties in. Now, obviously they had to be talking about the second coming, and it's obviously connected to the end of the world, and obviously it had to be at some point in the future, because why would they ask him, what's going to be the sign of your coming and the end of the world? And he's standing there right in front of him, so obviously he's already there. So they had to be talking about obviously a future. But it's so simple when you just sit down and you learn a few things, and you think, and you just open your mind and just think about it and get revelation from the Holy Spirit or whatever, and just calm down and take a look at this stuff and read it for what it says, and stop listening to these bozos with their stupid Steel of Solomon and their ridiculous satanic, Star of Solomon and all this. We went through this last week, the 666 symbolism and the 3 up, 3 down, so-called Star of Solomon. Anyway, but stop listening to all those morons and take this all in, and it all falls into place quite nicely. Okay. So be that as it may, so let's just move on. Okay, so we went through 29, 30, 31. Now 32 is interesting. Okay, learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye shall know that summer is nigh. Okay, let's just talk about that for a second. This is where a lot of these Israel first morons would probably say, oh, you see the fig tree in Matthew 24, and this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. That's obviously, and this fig tree is a symbol of ancient Israel. But remember, okay, if you go back a few chapters to Matthew chapter 21, I would tell these morons, what does Jesus say to the fig tree? May you never bear fruit again. Okay. So in other words, and the fig tree immediately withered. So in other words, Israel at that time is never going to bear fruit again. Okay? And remember, if you go back to chapter 3 in Matthew, John the Baptist says, the axe is already at the root of the tree. Any tree that does not bear fruit shall be cut down or chopped down and thrown into the fire, which is the fire, is the eternal fire of God's wrath, which, parentheses, I believe is a 5-month just hell on earth, okay, which is this time period, this tribulation, this payback tribulation, not the great tribulation that Christians have been experiencing and will for 2,000 years, and then will experience, much more pronounced here in the not too distant future. This is the second tribulation, okay, that's the payback tribulation, okay. So that's the fire that John the Baptist is referring to in Matthew chapter 3. Trees that do not bear fruit will be cast down and cast into the fire. So in other words, ancient Israel, at that point, the fig tree is chopped down, it's withered, it may never bear fruit again. Jesus is basically saying, you're all going to hell, you Jews that rejected me, okay? That's exactly what it's saying. So, that's a major contradiction now. We have a major problem here, don't we? But again, once again, just a calm down and a slow down and a careful reading of the text. You say, now learn a parable of the fig tree. It says, when his branches yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. Now, I will submit and concur that this no doubt refers to the regathering of ancient Israel to the land of Israel. Okay, in the Balfour Declaration, 1917, and the Rothschilds were in the middle of that whole deal. But let's just say May 14th, 1948, 31 years after that. I don't want to go off on that tangent right now. The retaking of Jerusalem from the Ottoman Turks and all that. Let's just say May 14th, 1948, Israel was reestablished as a nation. It's never happened in history before. Okay, this is where all these these chowderheads, okay, these Israel first, God's chosen people, this is what they point to. See, that's God's chosen people. Mind you, they're skipping over like 2,000 years of basic, history and sacrifices of people, that got thrown to wolves, literally, and burned alive at the stake, literally. They're skipping over all that just to go right to 1948 to support their idiotic interpretations of the Bible. But anyway, so that fig tree is tender. Okay, what does it say? It just says the fig tree is tender and it's green. Okay, so it's been reestablished. Israel's been reestablished, but it's not bearing fruit, is it? Okay, it's not bearing fruit at all. Now, I'm going to say that this refers back to Ezekiel chapter 36, where God says he will regather Israel in the end times and sprinkle clean water on them and save them. So he does plan on saving this last generation of Jews just out of pure compassion and pure sympathy, because he's going to regather them in 1948. And after the United States and the world experiences the economic collapse that's coming, and the United States gets nuked or EMP'd to death, as is spelled out in Revelation 17 and 18, there's going to be a wholesale run to retake Israel from the nations of the world. And I believe that's the real battle of Armageddon. Okay, and God is going to come down, and just like prior to this, he says, no flesh shall be saved. I believe part of that flesh that he's going to save at the very end will be national Israel, just out of pure compassion. These poor people. And I'm not being anti-Israel, by the way. When I say this, I mean, I have respect for the nation, just as an aside. Okay, and I've said this and I'll keep saying it. I'm not being, I'm not one of these, Zionist, anti-Semite types. I'm just saying what's in the Bible, purely the language in the Bible is when I sound so anti-Israel is all I'm referring to, okay, as a nation. I hope they're saved, and this last generation will be saved. And that's what's at play here, okay? And then we can get into this, the symbolism of the seventh seal in Revelation, and what's a green tree, and not harming any green trees, and telling Apollo or Apollyon or Osiris, the arisen, Osiris, and in Revelation chapter 9 and the seventh seal, okay, do not hurt, any grass or any green thing or any tree. Well, part of that tree is this fig tree, this reconstituted fig tree at the end of the tribulation, which is the year basically 33 AD till now. Okay, part of that green tree would obviously be the reconstituted Israel and the fig tree. But again, be very careful here, because the tree is not bearing fruit, so it's not a contradiction. It's just basically Jesus / God saying, all right, I'm going to have pure sympathy on these people at the end, because the entire world's going to be against them, so I'll step in and save them. But that's it. They don't bear fruit. They don't save anybody else. God chooses to save them, and that's his business, and that's his prerogative, obviously. But that's why this is not a contradiction, and it makes perfect sense if you match it with other verses and chapters in the Bible. And again, forget these morons telling you to send them money so they can send it to Israel. Forget all that. Okay, that's just what I just went through, is the proper interpretation. And the only thing that makes sense when you compare Scripture with Scripture, okay, nothing else adds up. There's going to be a contradiction. Okay. So we got that. So then he says, so likewise, ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. So in other words, remember in Revelation, I want to say Revelation 2, one of the churches, 7 churches, and I don't remember offhand, but he says, I stand at the door and knock, and he who answers, will sup with me, and I will sup with them. Obviously talking about the marriage of the Lamb with his bride, which is the body of Christ, or the representative of the female, okay, the male-female, the real male-female relationship, which is just the opposite of the male-female relationship I was talking about a few minutes ago, which was Isis and Osiris, the ancient Egyptians, okay, which is the anti-male-female relationship, by the way, as in Antichrist, okay, the spirit of Antichrist, okay, but there's no Antichrist term. It appears in 1 John and I think 2 John. It does not appear in the book of Revelation at all, by the way. But anyway, so likewise you shall see all things. Know it is that even at the doors. Okay, so basically this to me, line 33 is a summary. When you see all these things, okay, going all the way back to 1948, know that the time is at hand. Like, I'm knocking, and you really need to answer. Okay, if you go back to John chapter 10, I'm the door for the sheep. They go in, they go out to green pastures, and Jesus really goes to describe himself. If you go back to John chapter 10, and I don't want to go off on that tangent right now, but all that language, similar language, is found there in John chapter 10. Okay, now you go on to line 34. Okay, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Now again, this is where the Israel First, Hal Lindsey, made this huge mistake. Okay, a biblical generation in the Old Testament is generally regarded as 40 years. There's 70-year generations, there's 120-year generations. It's generally regarded as 40 years. Okay, off the top of my head, the best example I can think of that is, the book of Exodus, okay, where Joshua and Caleb and along with 12 other spies were sent into Israel. And the 12 spies, the promised land, after I think a few weeks, say 3 or 4 weeks in the desert, they had gotten there. This is before the 40 years of wandering in the desert. Okay, and 10 out of the 12 spies that are sent in say, no way, we can't take these guys. So really what happened was they signified, except for Joshua and Caleb, who said, yeah, we can take these guys, which were the giants, were leftover Nephilim from Genesis chapter 6. And again, now we're getting into Steve Quayle, Tom Horn, and these sorts of people territory, and I'll just touch on it and leave it at that. But anyway, this is what they saw, and 10 of the 12 said no way, and they were really, what they were indicating was a lack of faith in God. And Joshua and Caleb, of course, said were outvoted. And so God said, all right, is this what you want? And most of Israel sided with those 10, said they were scared to go into Canaan, which was called the land of Canaan at the time, and they didn't have faith in God is really what that was. So God says, all right, so I'm going to make you wander around this desert for 40 years or a generation until every male of military age dies off, except for Joshua and Caleb. So in other words, there was a new generation that entered into the promised land 40 years later. So So anyways, that's where people like Hal Lindsey came in and they said, well, Israel's God's chosen people in 1948. They were reestablished. That's our, so we had 40 years, a generation to 1948. He came up, so in other words, the world was supposed to end in 1988. Okay, and this is supposed to be a major biblical scholar, and he's still on TV. Okay, I don't want to. I don't know if I should be picking on anybody, but anyway, I'm just trying to make examples here of what not to listen to, and I'll just leave it at that. But just getting back to this. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Now that's very interesting. Okay. Again, you won't hear this anywhere else, I'm sure. So I don't know if you're listening. I don't know if there's two people listening, or I can only do what I can do, or nobody listening. But hopefully, at some point in the future, people get around to hearing this. But be that as it may, so you go back to a generation. Okay, where do we see? Go back again to the genealogy. Back there in Matthew, the first chapter of Matthew, and he goes through 42 chapters and three increments of 14, by the way, which is a very interesting number. Okay, remember, 14, what is 14? Oh yeah, that's the day of the Passover in Exodus 12. Okay, it's the 14th day. It represents the Thursday of Holy Week. Okay, we'll just say Thursday just to make the things line up. Remember, now Jesus had the Last Supper. He set himself up as a Passover lamb on day 14 of the Passover. Okay, so it's a very significant number. So when Matthew breaks down the genealogy of Jesus from Abraham until David, from David to the carrying away of Babylon, which we just talked about a few minutes ago, from the carrying away of Babylon to Christ, each one of those increments is 14 generations for a total of 42 generations. Okay. Now remember the concept of being born again. You're born again spiritually. This is discussed in John chapter 3. Okay, Nicodemus asked Jesus, how can you be born again? Can you crawl back inside your mother's womb? And Jesus says, no, you nincompoop. It's a spiritual rebirth. Okay. So in other words, when Jesus talks about this generation, he's talking about not a literal 40 or 70 generation. That doesn't make any sense. He's talking about two distinct generations. One is the 42nd generation, which ended with him, as I've just said. Matthew spells out the genealogy from Abraham to Jesus, and it says 42 generations. So, in other words, if you're born again, you're part of Jesus. You're part of the body of Christ. Okay, Colossians chapter 1. Okay, for example. Okay, Christ is a body. He's the head of the church or the believers. Okay, so in other words, you're part of that 42nd generation. Okay. Now, if there's a 42nd, then if you're part of the 43rd generation, remember what Jesus said in John chapter 8, ye are of your father the devil. So he's saying, God, again, God's chosen people, if they're born after the 42nd generation, that means they're part of the 43rd generation, okay, which is very interesting. So in other words, if you've accepted Satan, what the Jews did when they exchanged 30 pieces of silver to Judas, they rejected Jesus, the stone that the builders rejected, okay, which means they accepted another stone, which is obviously Satan, okay. Now let's just again, I'm going to say this: there's a stone that the builders rejected. There's a stone that means there's one that they accepted. Which one are they accepting? Right here. Now this all-seeing eye just so happens to represent the 14th level of this 13-level Egyptian pyramid. Okay. So can it again? I'll say it again. Can it be any more obvious? Okay. I just discussed the number 14. All right, there's number 14 from the Satanists run on the world. They've completely turned the Bible on its head, turned it upside down, and have taken Satan as their God. That's why I say these people are shot. They're gone. They're dark. They're Pharaoh of the Old Testament. Okay. Maybe I'm going from a bit of a tangent here, but this is very important with this concept of a generation. So just to review, forget the stupid, idiotic 40, 70, 120-year generation. That's all nonsense and garbage, okay? I mean, I should say that, but in this context it is. There's obviously symbolic meaning to those numbers and time to get into right now, but it's nonsense to try to apply it here to this line of Matthew 24. Okay, so there's a singular 43rd generation, which is very interesting. Let's just run back again. Let's just run back to the book of Exodus. Okay, we'll just run back to the book of Exodus real quick, and we'll go to Exodus chapter 20. All right. Give me one second here. We're going to go to Exodus chapter 20. And we're going to read something very interesting here. Now keep in mind what we're talking about. We're talking about the 43rd generation, which is the generation of Satan, which is the offspring of Satan. Okay, remember, because Jesus just said, you are of your father, the devil. He's saying your children. You're born of Satan. You're born again of Satan. My believers are born again of me. He's saying you people are born again of Satan. You have accepted Satan. Okay. Now right here, I am the Lord thy God, which have taken you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Okay. We want to talk about that right now. I mean, that's a whole other tangent, but obviously Egypt is a symbol of the world. If you go back to, I think it's Matthew chapter 2, and Jesus, Matthew is quoting, I think it's Malachi, okay? He says, out of Egypt I have called my son. So obviously Egypt, if it's Jesus is the embodiment of all believers, and from the year 0 to now, that means all believers throughout the world. Okay, so Egypt, in the Old Testament is Egypt, and in the New Testament, Egypt is the entire world, the entire globe. Okay, thou shalt not make any graven image, okay, of anything. So obviously that's idolatry. Okay, this is what the Jews were constantly being punished for through places like the book of Jeremiah and Jeremiah 7, which we discussed before. Thou shalt not. Okay, so now we're into the second commandment here. Okay, now this is very interesting. Thou shalt not bow thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers. The iniquity of the fathers, okay, which is the present, which is the Jews at the time, okay, the fathers upon the children. Okay, remember, you are children of the devil. Okay, so he's saying the fathers, they're idolatrous. Okay, they're whoring themselves. It goes back and forth with the symbol of male, female, but the concept is they're whoring themselves. But for the purposes of right now, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Okay, now 3 and 4, what do we get? We get 43, or the 43rd generation. Okay, now you could say, well, 4 generations, well, that's 2 generations, that's plural. However, okay, I believe what God's getting at right here, he's getting at this concept of the 3 plus the 4. The ancient Egyptian, remember we talked about this with the Egyptian right triangle, the 3, 4, 5 triangle. The 3rd and the 4th, that's Osiris on the vertical, remember, and Isis on the horizontal, the 3 plus the 4. And you combine those, you get their child, or the 5. What, can it be any more obvious? When he says he's punishing the children of the 3rd and 4th generation, it's an obvious reference to this crowd right here, this Gnostic or great geometry or great geometer of the universe, or this G we were talking about before, we're underneath the eye of Lucifer, okay, the 5 or the 5-pointed star, which is the number 1 symbol of Satan, okay. Now the reason I say that is because he's talking about 2, 3rd and 4th. I say he's not really saying a 3rd and 4th generation. He's saying the 43rd generation. Because remember, the 42nd generation is Jesus, as we discussed. So the 43rd generation, if you're not part of that generation, you're part of Satan's generation. Okay, now just hop back to. Well, I can just say it. If you go back to Matthew, I think it's 12, and the Pharisees, again, God's chosen people, the God, or the people that Jesus said, How can you escape being condemned to hell, and you are of your father the devil, and this sort of thing. He says, a wicked and adulterous generation, a singular, seeketh after a sign, but no sign shall be given to it except for the prophet of Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the beast. So in other words, it's a singular generation, the third and fourth generation that we just read about in Exodus chapter 20 in the second commandment is a single generation, and it is the seventh, the 3 plus the 4. The Freemasons like to add numbers together. With the third and the fourth, the male plus the female, the rose plus the cross, the Rosicrucians, the 18th degree of Freemasonry. Okay, it's all right there. All right, that's really what's being referred to when he says, this generation shall not pass away till all these things come to pass. So in other words, I believe, it doesn't matter. Okay, I would have to really think about whether he's talking about, the 42nd generation, but it doesn't really matter, because once the 42nd generation is completely gone, either martyred, killed for believing, which is going to happen to a lot of us here in the not too distant future, the way things are going, or raptured out at the very last second. Remember that unless I intervene, no flesh shall be saved. Unless you're part of that 42nd generation, you're part of the 43rd generation, and if you are, you got problems. Okay, you will incur the 5-month hell on earth, lake of fire, wrath of God, and then after that, God is gone, and you're left with nothing but an eternity in a valley of Hinnom, which is now a bottomless pit. There's no bottom to that valley. Okay, in symbolic terms, you will have nothing to think about for eternity except your life on earth in the last 5 months, as is symbolized in Revelation chapter 9. Okay, that's basically it. Okay, now let's just I guess that's probably a good place to stop. Okay, that's verse 34. Okay, that's Matthew 34, so we'll pick it back up at Matthew 24, verse 35 next time, hopefully Tuesday, which would be what? I guess that would be May the 2nd already, at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, hopefully, if nothing doesn't come up. But so we'll just leave it at that. But let me just say this. I mean, again, it's very important, God's simple salvation plan. If you're fortunate enough to be listening to this right now, it's available again on my site, boxofsunglasses.com. Let me just say this. I mean, to answer questions, I mean, I know it's an open, it's a 1 or 2. It's like a binary code. It's a 0 or 1. You're either in or you're out. That's kind of the way this is presented. Now, there's a lot of people never heard of God. I understand that. Okay, there's people out in the middle of Australia. There's people, who knows, in the Himalayas. These nations, they never had the opportunity to hear the word of God. Okay, so a lot of people ask, well, what about, how can you sit there and say all this? People that never heard of God, they're gonna be burned to hell because they never heard me speak, or maybe they just whole life. But that is addressed, okay, in Romans chapter 2, because the law of God is written on the heart of every human being. Okay, so in other words, people know what's right or wrong. They may not have read in the Bible, but if you just inherently, it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to murder, etc., etc. It's wrong to lie. Okay, and then also in Luke 12:47, 12:48, it says, those who are most in the knowledge or have the most to benefit are responsible for the most, are held to the much higher standard than, say, those who don't know or never knew or never believed. Okay, and in Acts 17, the Apostle Paul tells the Greeks, philosophers and these sort of people who are listening to him, says, God winked at a lot of the, your Old Testament and your paganism in Old Testament times, which to me says, he's going to overlook a lot of that, how exactly that pans out for those people. It's not really explicit in the Bibles, which means we don't really need to worry about it. But the point is, that I'm trying to make here is that, yeah, everybody's up for judgment, okay, and someone's going to be held, like the people in the United States, for example, that were the beneficiaries, and still are to an extent. What's left of the carcass of the United States, what was the greatest nation in the history of the world, will be held to the highest standard, biblically speaking. Okay, which means if you're listening to this right now in the United States, you really need to pay attention, okay, and not necessarily worry about, these questions are important. They're important to answer. They're important to edify your belief and answer a lot of the critics. But at the end of the day, you need to worry about yourself and those around you and those who are willing to listen, okay, is really what that's the answer to that question, okay. Then of course, somebody come along with them, why bother, evangelizing, why bother doing missionary work throughout the world? My answer to that would be, well, because that's the Great Commission. God said to do that. Jesus in the form of God said to do that in Matthew 28, go out to all the world and prophesy and all this, okay. So we must do it, okay. You just do it, okay. You can't just sit on your laurels and say, oh yeah, those people I've never heard are covered. I'm good, so I can just sit here. That's not how it works, okay. And I cannot ultimately answer all these questions, but it's just, you just need to read everything and just listen, okay. And then and that's it. Evangelize. It gives people hope. I mean, if you read, for example, Voice of Martyrs, okay, is another group I contribute to, okay. They bring hope through Bibles throughout all the world, okay. These poor people in Africa and Pakistan and North Korea, which is probably amongst the worst, okay. That's these people. That's their only hope, okay. So we need to evangelize, if nothing else, for that reason, okay. So anyway, hopefully that answers that question and kind of alleviates or answers the question, when it's, because it does sound pretty harsh when I say you're either the generation of Jesus or you're the generation of the devil, and there's no in between. There's no stupid purgatory like in the Catholic Church, penance, and that's the whole concept of paying indulgences. There's none of that. There's all garbage, okay. That's just doctrines of men, made up rules so people can empower themselves, and the Catholic Church can pilfer the poor, ignorant people of Europe for almost 2,000 years by saying, give us money so your relatives can, get out of purgatory. That's all that is, okay. So in other words, it's an open and shut case. It's in and out. Okay, it's a 1 or a 0, like a binary code in a computer, and it is that harsh. And hopefully, the recent, I invested the past several minutes, trying to answer that question. But again, boxofsunglasses.com, God's Simple Salvation Plan, and we'll pick it back up with, I guess we're going to say Matthew 35 next week. Good night and God bless.